Then I'll get started. Hello, my name is Amy Martin, and I'm on faculty in the Arnold School of Public Health at the University of South Carolina. My faculty appointment's in the Department of Health Services Policy and Management, but I spend most of my time as Deputy Director for the Rural Health Research Center. Our Rural Health Research Center is one of 6 that are funded by the Federal Office of Rural Health Policy out of the Health Resources and Services Administration in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. In that role, I spend a good bit of time doing policy analysis related to rural health care issues. Without a doubt, those issues usually always lead back to rural communities having access to well-trained, well-qualified, compassionate, reliable healthcare workforce, which is so germane to the topic today of precepting. And before I get started and talk to you about what we're going to do and discuss in these 2 separate parts of the power of precepting, I feel compelled to just make the case for precepting. I have spent 15 years, gosh, all the way back to 1996 now, precepting health profession students, both clinical as well as non-clinical. And I can tell you there's nothing more important than precepting young professionals, whether they're young in terms of their chronological age or young in terms of their tenure of service. I've seen preceptors really make the difference to really help reveal the aha moments for students. And then I've seen some preceptors outright discourage and really take some of the fire and enthusiasm out of the experience. So I hope that what we achieve today is your enrichment, your empowering, your wanting to go out and really champion the minds and the professional will of young healthcare professional students. So the first segment that we're going to discuss today, the getting started part, is the orientation. And here are our 4 task items, our learning objectives for this hour. One is a little brief discussion on what it means to be a preceptor. I think we all bring different life experiences and different ideas about what we think precepting is. So we'll have just a brief conversation about where the common ground lies. The second is how to effectively communicate with health profession students. Communication and preparation is 80% of the work when it comes to precepting, and conflict will naturally arise in precepting, as it does in any work experience. So I feel compelled to enrich this experience by drawing attention to learning styles, conflict resolution techniques, things like that really enriches the dynamic. The third objective is to help you identify what your students' learning needs are. And then finally, we'll wrap up this hour with doing a proper orientation. I will confess that I am a recovering director of education for a small rural hospital, and I did lots of orientations during my tenure there, and I can tell you there's no substitute for great preparation, great clarity, great laying of the groundwork before you engage in a precepting experience. So, preceptor, what does it mean to be a preceptor? Well, I borrowed these definitions straight out of the Webster Dictionary, and according to Webster, a preceptor is a teacher or an instructor. They are also an expert or a specialist, such as a physician, a nurse, an engineer, anyone who can give practical experience and training to a student, but especially this term is used in medicine and nursing. And I think preceptor is used in the health sciences because it goes more than being a teacher or an instructor or somebody with some sort of expertise. It's a helper, and I think an important word that I like to use is nurturer. Nurturing is certainly something we do in nursing and medicine and really all aspects of healthcare, which is why I think precepting is used in this way. I mentioned earlier that I've seen preceptors really help reveal the aha moments for some students, and I'm really create an unpleasant, unsavory experience for others. And my hope for you is that you're approaching this with an attitude of enthusiasm and delight. If that is your motivation, kudos. If this is something that's more of an obligation as a part of your job responsibilities, certainly I have no doubts that you're a consummate professional. What I hope that you get through this hour, though, is some revelation on how you can impact not just patient lives, but student lives and young professionals. If you're in medicine, if you're in nursing, if you're in radiology or any of the other allied health services or even administration, chances are you have not come into medicine without some intrinsic desire to improve the lives of people. And I think when you approach medicine or healthcare in that way, you have certainly a spirit of service. I would argue that that same spirit of service transcends not just improving the lives of patients, but improving the lives of people you work with. And as I said in my earlier comments, I come from a rural workforce background, and I can't tell you how difficult it is to recruit people to come to rural, let alone retain them and keep them there. So that's why I think precepting is both a professional and a moral obligation and responsibility. It is incumbent that you create a learning experience, a learning environment that reinforces all those goodwill attributes of why people come into healthcare to begin with. So this is a heavy responsibility that you'll be bearing as a preceptor. And again, whether you come into this experience wanting to do precepting or your supervisor has asked you to expand your other duties as assigned and take this role on, just know that you can really make a significant difference in the lives of these young professionals. So, as with any relationship, whether it be a spouse, a child, a supervisor, precepting, that relationship between preceptor and student is essential to have good communication, as good communication will beget harmony and hopefully a positive experience for both you and the student. So when I do this lecture and this presentation in person, I have the benefit of having some interactive activities. And unfortunately, in this format, that is lost. However, you see I have this slide that says, what's your learning style? Well, there's a whole science behind neurolinguistics that I find to be essential in having good communication between my husband and me, my parents, my supervisor, and even my own students. I train students in our department, MHA, MPH, and PhDs, and I find that we have better communication when I am clear about what their learning styles are compared to my own. And there's a general school of thought out there in the neurolinguistics literature that there are three types of learners. There's those of us who are kinesthetic learners. We learn better by touching. That's why the laboratory scientists do so well, because they get to touch and do things. Then there are those of us who are visual learners. We literally cannot process information without seeing it. These tend to be the heavy readers. And then finally, there are the auditory learners. They are incapable of processing information without hearing it. Students know this readily. They can identify their auditory peers readily because these are the folks who record everything. They carry their recording devices everywhere they go. They record the lectures, and then later they go back and play them over and over again because it takes hearing it in order for their brains to process. Now, it is rare that the learner embodies only one of those attributes. We tend to have a blended of kinesthetic, visual, and auditory learning preferences, although we do tend to have a dominant learning feature. Myself is visual, and the way you know that is probably during the course of this presentation, you're going to hear me disclose my preference by the use of my verbs. I am horribly guilty of saying things like, I see what you mean, because I literally do. I see what you mean. When you're speaking to me, my mind is visually transcribing the text and I can see the words. That tends to be my preference, although sometimes you will also hear me use feel. I feel this or I feel like that, and that is my kinesthetic preferences coming out. You will rarely hear me say, I hear you, because I don't. I have a very light auditory preference. As a part of cultivating your relationship with your students or your mentees, I would encourage you as a part of your orientation, and again, we're going to talk about what needs to go into orientation in just a moment, but I would take the moment to figure out, A, what are your own learning preferences if you don't think you really know, and then B, get your students to take a test. All you have to do is go on Google and Google learning style quiz or learning preference or learning inventories. There are literally no shortages of little quizzes. Half are scientific, half aren't. It really doesn't matter. It's just a really good exercise to kind of get a good feel for how people learn and take in information. So I would encourage you to do that. I will say, just to give you a practical example of why this is so important, I'll give you a story from my own experience. When I was director of education at a small rural hospital, I had the awesome responsibility of making sure that not only my workforce, but incoming students had all of their essential orientation deliverables in place for OSHA, DHEC, Joint Commission, so that we wouldn't get in trouble, which meant that my primary partner in this was my director of human resources, who has since turned out to be a very good friend, but we did not start out on the best of foots. She was a very she was a very auditory learner, and I, of course, was a very visual learner. And in order to make our files reconcile against each other, we had to communicate pretty regularly. And let's just say we weren't really good at email back then. Well, I am the Post-it queen. I keep up with things visually by keeping lots of Post-its. So when I would need something from her or need to communicate something of value to her, I would either walk over to her door and leave her a note, leave her a Post-it. I would send her an email, and I cannot tell you how distracting and frustrating that is to an auditory learner. She would call me and leave me 100 voicemail messages because she was accommodating her own learning style. I was accommodating my own learning style, and at the end of the day, we were just really annoying the hang out of each other. Even now, I discourage people from calling and leaving me voicemails because when I see something pop up on my voicemail, it just sends me into a tizzy because that causes me stress. I don't want to have to hear something. It's difficult for me to process it. I would much rather see it. So at the end of the day, when I came across a learning style quiz, she and I took it and we discovered we were not doing a very good job of accommodating our needs, our preferences for taking in and processing information. Once we recognized our differences and would accommodate the other person, wow, we were really, really going gangbusters. There wasn't much we couldn't accomplish. This is essential in a precepting experience. You know, as a professor, I have the luxury of working in a fairly sterile learning environment, the classroom. In the precepting student environment where there are real patients, real lives that hang in the balance, you don't have the luxury of having to say things multiple times. You need that student to catch on quickly. The student needs to catch on quickly. So to circumvent some of this getting to know you acclimation period, I would strongly encourage you to learn that student's learning style and try to accommodate that learning style as best as you can. It will just make that learning occur much more expeditiously. You're going to have conflict. We're going to talk about some of my own personal observations on student learning needs, but conflict is inherent in the preceptor-student experience. It's inherent in any close relationship, but it is particularly inherent in the preceptor experience. And I value precepting so much, and have seen some preceptors get burned because of unresolved conflict, and that's too bad because there's too few of you out there willing to take time out of your busy schedules to nurture a young professional. So I just shared this with you because I think it's important to know how to resolve conflict, or at least recognize your own inherent vulnerabilities and weaknesses, as well as your strengths in addressing unresolved conflict. I've gotten this and I've provided the source. Please follow up with this and take advantage of the tools and the instruments and the quizzes that accompany this book, Mastering Human Relations. I find it useful in my own personal relationships as well as my professional ones, but it says that there are 5 types of conflict resolution styles, and we have in the center the fox, and going around it clockwise we have an owl, we have a shark, a turtle, and we have a teddy bear. And again, if we were in the room together, I would have you take this quiz as an activity of self-awareness. But since we don't, I'm going to talk you through some of these, and I hope that you can go behind me and take a quiz and understand a little more about what your conflict resolution styles are. I think it's important to note that there's no good or bad. I think conflict has an inherent negative connotation to it. And I think that's unfortunate because I find conflict to be a wonderful teaching tool. I use it in my own classroom. Some of my students like to shy away from conflict, but I find that having conflict, which really just means a gap in perception of right and wrong, or a disagreement between two positions, can really cause somebody to challenge their own thinking. And when you challenge your own thinking, you really further science and you further practice, and we become better healthcare professionals because of conflict. So there is no good or bad. However, I will say that there are good and bad times when you use a particular style, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But I think in order to use conflict as a good teaching tool in the precepting experience, you need to have your own sense of appreciation and know which animal you are most likely to be and which one you're least likely to be. So we'll talk about the shark, the competing shark, which can get a really bad rap, unfortunately. There's times when you want to be the shark, and there's times you don't want to be the shark. And you'll see on this image that there are inherent attributes to the competing shark. The shark tends to be used when there is a forcing or a competing conflict occurring in your management. The competing shark tends to be highly goal-oriented. They want to be right. They need to win whatever the disagreement is. They need to win it. There is this balance. If you can imagine a quadrant where the lower is the value of the relationship and the left side is the value of winning an argument. For the shark, relationships take a back seat to winning the argument. And that sounds, those of us who are in the health professions, that sounds so self-centered and not a pleasant way to resolve conflict. But I will say, in defense of the competing shark, sometimes you want that shark to intervene. Sometimes, of course, you obviously do not, but relationships take a lower priority for the competing shark. The competing shark's techniques, they tend not to hesitate to use aggressive. Time is very important to them. They don't either have the luxury of time or they don't want to spend a lot of time arriving at conflict resolution. They will use aggression to get what they need quickly. They can be autocratic and authoritative. They can be perceived as intimidating and threatening, which is why sometimes if you have that shark tendency in conflict resolution, you tend to get a bad reputation. They have a need to win, but it's not just they need to win. Somebody needs to lose. And this is an important distinction as we work through our little animal kingdom of conflict resolution. They need to win either because of some inherent desire or whatever's at stake. There is a right and wrong. Sometimes conflict, there is a right and wrong, which means for the shark, the wrong needs to lose. You'll see in some of the other animals, there are places where there can be win-win. With the shark, there is no win-win here. The advantage in being the shark, if the shark's decision is correct, then a better decision can come about without any type of compromise. The disadvantage in working with the shark is that type of conflict resolution can lead to hostility and resentment. You know, in the preceptor-student environment, if there is a patient who is in danger, if it's an issue of patient safety, it's incumbent that you as the preceptor dig deep and find the shark in you, because at the end of the day, your primary responsibility, I don't have to tell you, is the patient. It's rare, though, I would think in the precepting experience that you would need to be the shark. So if you're not a shark, you don't have shark tendencies. In fact, if you're the antithesis of the shark and relationships are the most important thing to you, I would say if a patient's life is in jeopardy, you need to dig deep and find that shark. If being the shark is your primary role, and that's how you like to resolve conflict, and you have a difference between you and the student, I would encourage you to learn from the other animals that we're going to explore in just a moment and realize that being a shark can actually damage your relationship with the student, and when you damage that relationship, the student loses the ability to learn from you because trust is broken and the communication starts to withdraw. So competing sharks, with the exception of the example that I gave you, may not be the best animal in the precepting experience. Here are some examples of some other times when it's good to be the shark. When conflict involves personal differences that are difficult to change, meaning there's some things that you just cannot negotiate a compromise over. That's when you want to be the shark. When, quite honestly, fostering intimate relation and supportive relations is not critical, that's a good example. When others are likely to take advantage of non-competing behavior, you want to stand up and be the shark. When conflict resolution is urgent, and again, the patient safety issue is probably the best example. And then finally, when unpopular decisions need to be made. You'll find in the healthcare experience, anyhow, your hospital administrators at times have to be the sharks. And unfortunately, in this economy, when layoffs are essential and you're having to make very unpopular decisions very quickly, being the competing shark, unfortunately, has to be the course. So there's the shark, and then there's the avoiding turtle. And just as the image conjures, turtles tend to withdraw from conflict. They don't like conflict. They tend to hide and ignore. They don't want to deal with it. This leads them to being perceived as uncooperative and unassertive. And actually, even to a degree of apathy. Sometimes you'll hear people say, I just show up, and do my job and leave. They don't want to get sucked into the conflict. So turtles can be perceived as being apathetic. They tend to give up all their personal goals, display very passive behavior, and really create lose-lose situations. The advantage in being an avoiding turtle is it actually can help maintain relationships if resolving a conflict is just not possible. The disadvantage, though, is your conflict remains unresolved, and the overuse of this style tends to result in people just walking away or not engaging with the turtle because they think they don't care. Times when it is good to be the turtle is when stakes really aren't high and issues are trivial. So if you're not having to resolve something of high importance, then it's okay. Sometimes it is good to walk away. I have a hard time doing that, but that'll be my confession to you. When confrontation hurts a working relationship, it's okay to be the turtle. I find that I'm the turtle when the timing's just not right. That's not to say that I won't be the shark at the end of the day, but sometimes I have learned that being the turtle is a matter of timing, that picking my battles and picking the right time to fight those battles means I am the turtle, at least temporarily. When there's little chance of getting what you need, is a good chance to be the turtle. And I won't go through all of these. You can read them on the slide. But it's curious. Being a turtle, I find, can be a practical conflict resolving technique with my students, especially when I'm precepting or teaching in group. I'm a big believer and a big fan of group dynamics. And when there's conflict amongst my students, or even conflict between me and the students, I find sometimes if I withdraw and not mediate the conflict and let them discuss it, sometimes they will push their own envelopes and really start to think a little deeper rather than me telling them what to think. And it does facilitate some interesting brainstorming, which we'll see in the next segment as an interesting teaching technique. So I find sometimes being the turtle is useful in enhancing learning. The accommodating teddy bear. Now, I will say this. If you're in healthcare, I would be very surprised that if you don't have some attributes of the accommodating teddy bear. The teddy bear accommodating relationships is very, very important. The disadvantage in being a teddy bear is you tend to give up more than maybe you should just for the sake of compromise, just because the relationship is so important to you. You tend to use a soothing, accommodating, peaceful resolution technique. You tend to be unassertive and cooperative. And unfortunately, that results in a win-lose situation where you, the teddy bear, tends to lose more than you gain. So you give up resolving the conflict in favor of keeping the relationship. And that's totally appropriate when the conflict is not that big a deal, where maintaining the relationship is actually of greater value than solving whatever the difference of opinion may be. So that's a positive. And certainly when time is on your side, when you have the time and can afford that kind of loss, that is good. And I will say in the precepting experience, being a teddy bear, there is a balance. One thing that I will caution you on as a preceptor is maintaining that safe balance between being somebody's buddy and being somebody's mentor. Students will come to you, and we tell them, and I'm sure I'm not the only faculty person that tells their students this, that the best thing that they can do for themselves professionally is find a mentor. And usually it's a preceptor, because that mentor is really going to help you cultivate your learning and research needs, help you feel your way, help you develop your leadership skills. And sometimes that line can get blurred into becoming more of a buddy and a friend. And certainly I'm not suggesting that you not be friends with your students. But it's just like being a good parent. Sometimes you have to be the parent and not the friend. Same thing with precepting. And teddy bears tend to forget that. Sometimes they will err too far on the side of friend, and then you lose your ability to be an effective teacher. You become too much of a buddy. The compromising fox. The fox is really clever, as the animal would suggest. And the thing about the fox is the fox wants a balance. They understand that there should be a concern for the goals of the disagreement as well as a concern over the relationships. And so they want to appear to be assertive. They want to appear to be cooperative. They're consensus builders. And they don't want to lose-lose. And they don't want to win-lose. They want to win-win. They want everybody to walk away getting something, maintaining the relationship as well as achieving some common ground on the conflict. And the advantage is you walk away with everybody feeling like you got something out of this experience. The disadvantage is at the end of the day, when you do compromise, you do give up a little something. So that's a negative. And it may be on an issue where you maybe shouldn't be giving up on something. But the good thing about being a fox is you are perceived as somebody who is power neutral, and you have the best interests of the person and the issue at play. You can be a fox. It's great to be a fox, unless you don't have a lot of time on your hands, because I don't have to tell you, building consensus and compromise takes a good bit of time. So finally, there is the collaborating owl, the wise owl. The owls use collaboration as an essential tool in resolving conflict. They want win-win just like the fox does. But they want to walk away with you getting everything that you wanted. So that requires a great deal of time. In the precepting experience, I think of the preceptor as a collaborating owl, as somebody who is a professional, making sure that that student is learning everything that the preceptor thinks the student needs to learn. But here's the distinction about the owl. The owl will also make sure that the student learns everything that the student needs to know, or at least thinks he or she needs to know. This is an important distinction, and I'll tell you, this is a real challenge for those of us, even in academia. We have our competencies, just like you do, that our accrediting bodies say that our students need to learn. And so we tend to develop learning experiences and syllabi and course packages wrapped around what those competencies are as prescribed by the accrediting bodies. Well, a good owl, and Lord knows I try to be a good owl, the good owl will make sure that she or he goes through those checklists of competencies. But then the owl is going to reach out to the student and say, okay, here's what I've been told or I think you need to learn. What else is there? What else do you want to know? What can I do to help further your knowledge? And accommodates that. And sometimes conflict will arise in there because, A, you don't have enough time to do that. Let's be honest. You're a full-time practitioner trying to take care of patients. But this is a great opportunity, not just for the student to get his or her additional learning needs met, but also further your own professional experience. I can't tell you how many times when I have checked in with my students as an owl to say, what have I not taught you that you think you need to know beyond what's in this curriculum? They've pushed me to further my own knowledge base and comfort zone. And just as the owl wants, everybody walks away with a win-win. It is labor intensive, but it is so terribly, terribly rewarding. And I've already spoken about those points. Relationships, obviously, with my students is of the utmost concern. And fortunately, I have a lot of time that you all maybe not. So transitioning, and I've started laying the groundwork for this, but observations about today's students and today's learner. And this is where conflict really becomes inherent. I just can't tell you how much my students have changed, even in the last 5 years, let alone the last 10 years, in terms of what their needs are, how they learn, the electronic media at their disposal. It's different in that their attention span tends to be more narrow, but the scope of things that they want to learn about has just exploded. So it's almost as though they want to know a little bit, or I have enough of their attention, a much more narrower attention span to address a much broader array of topics. It's very, very challenging as an instructor, and I assure you as a preceptor it becomes more challenging. In my interactions with preceptors recently, it's really been mixed. Some who've been doing it for a while just relish it. They just love it and say that they get so much out of their students, and it's really pushing them professionally to broaden their own learning horizons. But then I have some others, honestly, that it's not been rewarding, and it's been frustrating because they feel like they don't have the attention of their students. The perception is the students don't have the same kind of work ethic that they were trained to have. And it is a different world. It's a different balancing act. Students bring different experiences to that learning encounter that you've got to be mindful of. I find it to be way more challenging. I have learned to really address my student experiences a little differently. I find that if I set the expectation bar high and expect them to meet my expectations rather than the other way around, it's more rewarding for me and it's more rewarding for them. I think what happens sometimes, at least in my experience, in my own teaching, if I set the bar low and then periodically raise it, they will perform at whatever that threshold is. And I find that students really don't want to be treated that way. Even the young students, they want to be treated as adults. Some of them perceive themselves to already be at the level that you and I are, and that is established professionals, and they're not, but they want to be treated that way. So I have learned, if I treat them that way and treat them more as a colleague, and as somebody who's there to help them, and not really be condescending to them, that they really and truly do rise to meet my expectations. But it is varied. It's varied based on if they're undergraduate versus graduate, where they are in their curriculum. I find those that are just at the beginning bring a little more arrogance and swagger than those that are later in their course of study when they've figured out, gosh, I don't know what I don't know. So it is different, but I find approaching the experience with a mutual respect and a raised bar that they will actually stand up and meet your expectations. But it's my experience right now that students' learning needs have changed in ways that our academic curricula have been slow to catch up with, which makes it even more challenging for you. So here's some things just to keep in the back of your mind as you work through cultivating that relationship with your students. So the first one is just a basic. Every learner had a life before they arrived, and it's important to know that even adult learners, and when I say adult, I even mean 18-year-olds, they're really not acquiring new skills, but refining what they learned along the way. So I think that's important in the precepting experience, because I think some preceptors will approach that experience with, okay, here's what you don't know, and this is what we've got to train you to do. And that can be very condescending and very frustrating to the student learner. Recognizing that they have already, even though they may not have clinical skills or know how to take a blood pressure, but they do have a life experience, and that you're just helping to enhance and build on that, instill some confidence in them that maybe is lacking. So this is an important principle to know. The second one is learners fluctuate with dependency from being totally self-directed to being totally dependent on you. And there is no natural progression or this continuum. There is this flip-flop, if you can imagine that. And it's really where learners fall out on that continuum of total dependency to total self-direction really has to do with three things: their maturity of whatever the information is you're trying to convey, their experience with you, and then the group dynamic. Whether it's an individual two-person group or you're working with multiple students. So maturity with the content, experience with the structure, with the instructor, and then just the general dynamics will determine where they fall out on that continuum. And I really like this continuum, and I really like this notion of self-directed learning, and it's something that I've struggled with in my own instruction. And to be blunt and honest and sound like an old cynical codger, if you will, I get frustrated sometimes because I feel like my students lack self-directed learning. And when I sense that, if I get frustrated by that, because I can be critical of my own students, I feel like they don't have good critical thinking skills or problem-solving skills, which are two characteristics that are inherent to self-directed learning. That's when I drop my bar. And when I drop my expectation bar, that makes me angry, and then I start to get condescending with my students, and then it really hurts our rapport. I have to remember that self-directed learning is a skill, and if people before me have not coached students on self-directed learning, then it's unreasonable of me to expect that. So I encourage you as a preceptor, as I encourage my own self, to try to teach how to be a self-directed learner while I'm teaching whatever skill or practice that I'm trying to convey as well, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. A few other principles worth keeping in mind as you cultivate your relationship with your student is learning must stem from experiences, experiential learning, and I hear this from my students all the time. We teach them policy or we teach them this skill. If we give it to them and then don't give them the opportunity to apply it or observe it in a short window of time, it's lost. It really, really is. So in thinking about how you're going to structure your preceptor experiences, just remember, whatever skill you're trying to convey, you've got to give them the opportunity to practice it, observe it, experience it within a short amount of time, or it really takes on no practical meaning for them. The fourth, and this is very important, and I'm guilty of this, we're all learners. Learners learn what they think they need to learn. If I don't think I need to know it, then I'll listen to you, but I am not going to absorb whatever you just shared with me. And this is frustrating if you're working with a student who really doesn't see the value in whatever it is you're trying to convey, which means you have to be creative and come up with ways to either convince them that they need to know it or infuse some artificial need to know attitudes into your students. And doing that without the risk of causing them harm or harm to your patients can be a challenge. But if your students don't think they need to know it, they're not going to take in what they need to know. So you're going to have to cultivate that. And I find the best way to do that is sharing times when you've messed up. They love to hear when I've screwed up in the classroom, because they recognize if it could happen to me, it's going to happen to them. So maybe I do need to pay attention, and maybe she actually does know what she's talking about. Number 5, everybody, especially in a group environment, needs to feel incorporated, accepted, and supported. And one way to do this is to create a common ground. I'm not sure what your experience is going to be. I'm a real big fan of interdisciplinary precepting, where you've got students from different disciplines, and this principle certainly applies to that. And I'm a long relative of AHEC, and AHEC really embodies this quite well. When you're working with students from medicine, nursing, radiology, PT, OT, administration, they're all bringing some professional bias to that experience. Before you get started, I think it's important to find the common ground, and there's always common ground, and that common ground will forever and always be the patient experience. So demonstrating how each of those professionals plays in that patient care experience and how they're all interdependent enhances the learning, not just from each other, but from learning from individual professions. To be blunt, I think you want to create an environment where medical students feel that there's value in learning from nursing preceptors, or vice versa. Your nursing students see the value in learning from CEOs or learning from radiology technicians, and that they're not so professional centric or shoved into a silo that the only learning that can occur is from learning, or the only learning that can occur is from professionals like myself. That is such a dangerous way to think, and it really inhibits your ability to learn from the other disciplines. And if you don't have a preceptor structure like that, I would really encourage you to think about that. And as a teaser, in the next segment, we'll talk about how to do group precepting. Finally, there's got to be something in it for you. So I like to tell people that everybody can learn and will benefit from this type of work. You know, I find that certainly I learn a lot from doing my own research, doing my own self-directed learning, but I learned so much from my students. And I'll just give you a quick example. This ties back to principle number 3 anyhow. I had this last semester a group of students who were completing their MHA degree, and I teach rural health policy. And the whole semester is focused on rural health policy, reimbursement, Medicaid, Medicare, third-party payers, state practice acts, things like that. So I like to do a field trip, though, that illustrates the importance of populations for whom policy has left behind, which means we're talking about the uninsured. So this semester, I took my students on a field trip to a free clinic out in the middle of a sea barrier island off the coast of Charleston, where it literally looks like third world poverty. And they got to meet physicians and nurses who are providing this type of care. And I'd been telling them all semester that even though they're going to be administrators, they have an integral role in the healthcare experience that cannot be dismissed. And so many of them who've never had any kind of real world experience were a little disappointed in that maybe they had chosen the wrong career, that they really wanted to make a difference in the lives of people, and they just weren't sure how getting an MHA and being an administrator would do that. They felt like maybe they should have a clinical experience. So when I took them on their field trip and they got to meet these wonderful nurses and wonderful physicians, we got back on the bus and we had one of those wonderful aha moments where one of my students said, I get it now. This is my job. This is my job to create a corporate culture or an organizational environment that supports nurses, and other providers to go out and touch the lives of people. And they were really, really sweet in that, in some ways, that's a totally different plane of responsibility. And no, I don't get that immediate benefit of touching the lives of an individual patient, but by creating an organization, creating a culture that enables hundreds of people to do that on a daily, hourly basis, then it made her feel like, this one particular student, it made her feel like she really is making that difference. So that was just an example of wrapping up all these principles of how everybody gets a win-win. And for me, it was a win-win because I had been trying to teach her that in different ways, but it was through that experiential learn that it was really codified in her mind. And it was interesting. We all walked away from that experience refining their professional purpose. So I've been talking about this notion of self-directed learning, and I'm a big believer in this. And in some ways, today's students are better equipped to be self-directed learners because they have, frankly, many more resources at their disposal than you and I ever had. But in some ways, it's also more challenging to get them there. Self-directed learning, the hallmark of self-directed learning is that they're problem solvers and they're able to identify their own learning needs. And I'll dissect that a little deeper for you in just a moment. But to contrast the old way of thinking versus the new way of thinking when it comes to precepting and education, knowledge should be, in the old way of thinking, presented by you and me, preceptors and instructors. Not necessarily anymore. Now it needs to be elicited. That's not to say that we don't have some competencies that we have to guarantee we provide to our students, and quite honestly that they expect us to give them, but they want to be engaged in that process as well. In the old way of thinking, the principal resource of education was academia and research. Now not so much. Now it is certainly academia and research, but also their own engagement in self-directed learning or problem-based learning, experiential learning. These are all important terms. And then finally, the basis of education, the old way of thinking, students learn facts in the absence of real work. Now it is real work with graded responsibility, which is exactly what the preceptor experience is. It is actually getting to do stuff, to put what they've learned in action, to refine that knowledge through experiential learning and through the mentorship of folks like you. So I'm borrowing this content from Dr. Franklin Medeo, who is just a prominent clinician and faculty member down at the Medical University of South Carolina. I'm a big fan of his work. He is well published in the area of preceptor training, of preceptoring, and I have those references at the end of the next segment, but this is from one of his slides that I got to witness that I thought was interesting. The 6 essential elements of being a self-disciplined professional, certainly being present. And I like present, number 1, and number 4, being prepared, kind of together. What he meant by being present and being prepared wasn't just showing up. Anybody can just show up, but it's being in the moment, being excited, both as a self-directed learner from a preceptor perspective and a student, but that you come to that learning experience with energy and excitement and wanting to do more and further your practice, further your science, having that kind of enthusiasm that you just can't buy. Being presentable, number 2, which is a little more practical, and I'll confess, some of my younger students, we've had to really coach them on this. Being presentable means looking professional. If you're going to walk the walk, you've got to look like it. And I'll confess, I hurt the feelings of one of my students. He came into my class one day with one of those Bluetooth devices in his ears, and I teased him and said, unless you're about to seat somebody at the Outback restaurant or you're working the fitting room at the Gap, you don't need to be wearing that in my classroom. So the reason we do that is not to be mean-spirited and tease them, but that I don't have to tell you that patients perceive professionalism with your physical appearance, and they pick up on your body language, and you should expect that from your students. And I would make this clear with them as a part of orientation. You know, it's not that we're being sticklers and being difficult to work with, but there is a perception about quality of care. And everything I've ever read, perception of quality of care stems from the way the clinicians present themselves, as well as the physical environment of the facility. Is the wallpaper new? Is the carpet clean? You know, if we expect those types of attributes of the building, we expect the same for the professional. So we hone that in. Being punctual, yes, being punctual. I don't have a problem with that anymore in my classroom. I don't know what's going on with today's learners. I don't know if there is an eagerness, but I will tell you about 5 years ago, we had some punctuality problems. I don't know if you're experiencing that in your own preceptor experiences, but I would make that very clear on what your expectations are with being punctual. I like number 5 a lot. I don't have a problem being positive. I am by default a positive person. I think it's because I love what I do. I love being a part of the healthcare experience. I love it from a training perspective. I love it from a research perspective. And I'm lucky enough to be involved in direct service delivery. So I get to participate in the triple threat of healthcare, and I love it. And I think my students recognize that. This becomes important because self-directed learners, if they're not positive, then they're inherently not self-directed. If you don't have a great outlook and a great energy for what you do, you can't be self-directed. So this is my challenge to you as a preceptor. Whatever mood, whatever energy level you bring, you are infectious. You are a contagion, a professional contagion. So I would encourage you to bring an exuberance to that precepting experience, because students are chameleons. They will take on whatever energy you're possessing. So they need to feel it. They really need to feel it in order to really get the most out of that precepting experience, and take that and pay it forward once they become professionals and preceptors. So it's very important. I've already talked about the being positive, the being prepared, the being proficient. That doesn't mean perfect, which is why I've kind of listed number 7 and struck through it. Being proficient really means being persistent. Forgive me for using another P word, but not being satisfied with mediocrity, not being satisfied with just meeting a standard, but exceeding that standard, exceeding those expectations, raising that bar. That just raises everybody's expectations and energy and excitement for the healthcare experience. Oh no, and that's a horrible slide. What does the self-directed learner look like? There's a list of these, and actually I will clean this slide up and present it in the next segment after we take a break so that you can see it, because I really do love this slide. The self-directed learner is somebody who can negotiate his or her own learning needs. They're really good at self-evaluation. They're really good at giving honest feedback for themselves. It's the exact kind of learner you would like to be for yourself. But I'll clean this up so that you can see it for the next time. Tools and skills of self-directed learning. These are things that self-directed learners need in order to define what their learning agenda is. They're very good at retrieving information, which is why today's student is excellent. They have so many resources at their disposal, many more than you and I had. They're really great at storing and evaluating information. I I get frustrated sometimes with my students because I see a tendency not being able to synthesize or apply information, which leads to the problem solving. The storing, evaluating, problem solving in my mind all go together quite well. Especially when I'm lecturing on policy, and I would guess the same is true for practice as well in a precepting experience, where here are facts A, B, and C. Now, how do A and B impact C? How are they integrated? How does this all synthesize to a common place? They can struggle with that sometimes, I think, because so many answers are at their disposal. There's so much information you can retrieve. It's almost too much to put together. And I guess the best analogy or the best metaphor for demonstrating that is electronic health records and health information exchange. At the risk of dating this presentation, because I fear in another 2 years we'll have all that conquered as well, but in working with clinicians, what I hear, one reason that information is not exchanged through EHRs like they should be is because it's just too much. I don't need to know everything about every patient that ever happened to him. I need to know what are their drug allergies and what are their diagnoses so that I can better inform a care plan. Kind of the same thing with learning. Sometimes I think we overwhelm students with way too much information and we don't provide it in a sequelae in a way that they can assimilate it and make practical use of it. The self-directed learner is really good at saying, whoa, let me give back to you what I think you have shared with me. Here's how I see it being beneficial. Here's how I see me using it. Now, what have I missed? That's what self-directed learning is, which leads me to that last fifth point is question refinement. They're very good at saying the whoa, here's what I think you've said, here's how I think I can use it, now what about this? Which is why they're the best students to work with, because they'll keep you challenged. Just when you think you've told them everything you think they need, the self-directed learner is going to come back at you with more questions, making you stretch your cognitive and professional muscles in ways that you did not anticipate. It's a joy. It's an absolute joy when you encounter that type of a student. And I have the question for you. Can you think of others? Reflecting, for those of you who maybe have done precepting, have you observed self-directed learning in your students or in your peers? And if you have, what skills and tools have you observed them using? It would be very interesting to see how those skill sets change as they make use of things like EHRs. So what do? You have the self-directed learner, and that's great, and that's a wonderfully thoughtful, challenging dynamic. But for students who aren't necessarily self-directed, how do you get them there? This is a challenge to me. This is definitely a challenge to preceptors. So here's some suggestions. Make it a goal. Orientation, again, is a part of cultivating that relationship and identifying what goals you want to address in your precepting experience. Make it a goal and explain to them why self-directed learning is so valuable, not just as a student, but as an ongoing healthcare professional. Think about your own personal professional history and how your work has changed over the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years. How the technology has changed, how the patient expectations have changed, how your licensure expectations have changed. It's essential in healthcare that we be self-directed as learners. So you're not just conveying this as a goal in your preceptor experience, but as a skill they will need after they leave you. You yourself can model attitudes of lifelong learning. As a preceptor, if you're not engaged in your professional associations, if you're not staying on top of the literature, then you're really at risk for not being a great preceptor. And students will smell that. They will know it. Olfactory, by the way, is not a learning technique. I just realized I used that verb. But anyhow, they will sense if you're a dedicated lifelong learner or if you're just a grunt worker here to do what you've been trained to do. They'll sense that. So if you're not doing it and you're signing on to be a preceptor, I would encourage you to model that lifelong learning love in your precepting experience. The third, provide learners with options. And I like this because you can't expect somebody to be a self-directed learner if you don't encourage that through the learning experience. Said differently, when you just force feed knowledge in one way, then you're still creating that tunnel vision for learning. When you give people options for learning something, or even give a cadre of techniques for conveying the same concept, then that causes the student to broaden how they might absorb information and enhance their own learning styles. So that's one thing you should do. The other is ask your students to develop their own learning contracts. I love doing this. I do this in the course of my teaching. I have my syllabus, I have my learning objectives that the university expects me to go over, but then I always leave some blank. And I ask the students, what else? What do you think you need to know? Well, invariably, they don't know what they need to know early in the semester. So I will bring in guest lectures. I will provide video documentaries. And at the end of every segment, I will say, what was in here that's new information that you need to know more about that's not covered in this course? I'll give you a prime example. This most recent semester, I had the Vice President of Finance and Operations for the Hospital Association to come and speak to my students. Of course, my textbook and my reading cannot keep up with the rapid, ever-changing landscape of healthcare reform. So I asked him in an interview in front of my students, what were the 3 things that my students needed to know to be competitive in the job market and really hit the administrative field ahead of the crowd? And he said, without a doubt, ACOs, Accountable Core Organizations, value-based purchasing, and health information exchange. None of those were 3 things that are taught in our curriculum right now. They're addressed in special topic ways, but there's no dedicated curriculum space to those 3 topics. So when he left, we developed a learning contract around those 3 topics. And I said, I'm not going to teach you this. This isn't within the parameters of our course, but clearly you need this to be competitive and be successful. And they created their learning contracts, and some students said that they would pursue some content on ACOs, and then the others said they would pursue some content on the value-based purchasing. And what they did was come together and teach each other what they learned. It was great to observe that kind of self-directed learning. So I would encourage you in your precepting experience to do something like that. Encourage questioning. Let me just tell you, in the same group, we ended on a good note, but we sure didn't start off on a great foot. They're scared to death to ask me questions. And they're going to hold you as the preceptor in a much more haloed level because you're a real working professional. They're scared to death to ask you questions. You've got to encourage that. You've got to push them. And even if they don't ask you questions, you need to ask them questions so that they will understand that this is an acceptable form of dialogue. I don't know if it's because they perceive questions as being insulting or intimidating. I don't know. I don't know where that's coming from. But I know that they cannot grow into self-directed learning without the ability to know how to ask the right types of questions. And then assign projects requiring learners to set their own direction. You know, in the precepting experience, there's nothing that precludes you from assigning homework, asking them to do a little something for you. You'll see in the next segment, one thing I encourage folks to consider is getting their students to do little mini presentations to your own colleagues. Getting them to research a topic or interview a patient, engage patients to hear what they think about certain issues. But it's okay to get them to do things other than just shadow you. And that helps them, going back to what we've already discussed, apply what they've observed in a real way that locks in through experiential learning. Identifying learning resources. Share with them, and I like to group 7 and 8, actually 7, 8, and 9 together, your own personal learning. Encourage them to go to your professional association's journal, the Medical Association, JAMA, or the nursing journals, or certain websites, although I'm a little itchy about websites. But give them some suggestions on where you go for your own learning enhancements. Expect them to have reading plans, just like you have reading plans for yourselves. Assist them with developing their own personal retrieval systems for information. That may or may not be journals. Related to that is network of peers. You know, I find that I've been very lucky in my own professional career to have had 3 important mentors fall in my career path. And these are people I can trust, I go to when I have questions. And I would encourage you to encourage that kind of network building in your own students. Which leads me to 10, pointing out educational consultants. You know, if you're getting your information from one source, then your way of thinking is automatically biased. And I like to surround myself with consultants, not just people I agree with, but people I disagree with. I'll use a political metaphor. I lean in one direction and my political philosophies align with one party primarily, but I find when I listen to the other side, it causes me to question some of my own philosophical beliefs, and it causes me to think about problems in a 360-degree way that has caused me to fall out on sometimes the contradictory way of what my political party thinks. And I think that type of reaching out to different educational consultants who maybe come from different places causes me and causes my students to stretch their own muscle. I'll give you a healthcare example. I just participated in a conference where the CEO of McLeod Regional presented, and very, very impressive man who was sharing that he visits with private industry in his community in Florence County pretty routinely. And it's not just a pressing of the palms, feel good kind of a way, but he actually spends time. I'll give you an example that he gave me. I can't remember if it was GE or Honda, but it was somebody who makes something. It was a manufacturing organization. And he engaged their quality improvement engineers and asked them to come and teach his folks how to do something better in his hospital. And he really encouraged me, and I'm encouraging you by way of him, to broaden your educational consultants beyond healthcare, because it's amazing. It's amazing the parallels between education and healthcare and manufacturing and healthcare and how we can do things differently and better. So I've beaten number 10 to death, but that's my point on number 10. Number 11, emphasize critical appraisal of the literature, including the utility of data. I do this in my classroom, and I would certainly encourage you do this in the patient care setting. Just because a journal published it and they said this is the right way to do it doesn't mean it's the right way to do it. So sometimes self-directed learning and the way you can get a learner there is to find an article, sit down over a cup of coffee, and critique it. Sometimes precepting is not at the bedside. Sometimes it's at the computer, and really explaining why you think findings are relevant or important or quite frankly out of touch with what your practical experience is. And then finally, self-evaluation, and I'm not going to talk about that because we'll talk about evaluation in just a moment. So I'm going to wrap up now by talking about orientation, and getting started is indeed the hardest part. Again, I was director of education for a hospital, so I'm a big believer in orientation. So here are the pieces that you need to think about for your orientation. And if you don't have a formal precepting orientation, I would really encourage you to embrace that. Orientation is really where everything comes together. Certainly you have your checklist of here's your life safety codes and here's what's expected. And certainly you address that through the standards and expectations, and you go over the disciplinary and evaluation process. But here's where you discuss those learning styles, and here's where you discuss and set the stage for that contagious, that infectious spirit of service and professionalism. And here's what we expect from your attitude and your motivation. And here's where you can address the self-directed learning. Here's what I want for you as a professional. Now, what do you want for yourself? Well, that's where all that negotiation happens. And it's a remarkable, respectful, inspiring activity that's really a process and not an event. And what I would encourage you to do in your orientation is to do it as a group, either with multiple students or multiple professionals. Maybe you have co-preceptors. Do this in a group where people can express their concerns in a way that they might not do at an individual level. And make sure it's all documented. And I love evaluation science. That's what I spend a lot of my time doing. It's in the orientation where you set the parameters for the evaluation. Here's how we're going to evaluate you. Here's what we're going to say. This is what you did as a good student, or this is how you've passed your competencies, so that folks know up front what's expected of them. So we're just getting started. My summary of thoughts is that it's through the beginning of the relationship, through orientation, that you cultivate the spirit of energy through good communication, having a thorough orientation, and you as the preceptor accepting and assuming what I think is a huge professional and moral obligation, that you will literally shade the professional experience that these students are going to embark on in ways that not myself or anybody else will ever shade. So I'm going to thank you for your time, and I'm going to stop right now, and we'll get started on part 2 momentarily.